So welcome. Thank you for making time to come. I'm sure many of you have end-of-term commitments, so it's really nice to see such a good turnout. There are I'm sure, people at Ryerson convulsing with laughter at the fact that I have been asked to talk about women in science and technology because I started my career with a master's degree in medieval history from this institution. And I fell into a technology career quite inadvertently and then went on to do further education. Reflecting on my own experience, which is the first thing that I was asked to do, is there is no question the workplace today, universities today are dramatically different than they were when I graduated and started my career. In fact, I remember my first job at the Ministry of Transportation Communications working with engineers. First of all, I didn't know what an engineer was until I had my master's degree in medieval history and was working with them. I always thought it was the guy at the back of the train who you wave to in the caboose. So when I think about that, what I realize is that as someone who was actually quite good at math and quite good at science in high school, there was a huge gap in the kind of support, counseling, and so on that girls in particular received in making their choices. The second thing is the nature, and I think that's changed a lot. The second thing is the nature of the workplace. So imagine, I was very young when I graduated with my master's degree, I think it was 20. First job, surrounded by engineers with the little flashy iron rings, sunshine girls up and down the walls. You all know what the sunshine girls are. And men who constantly commented on female anatomy as women were walking back and forth up and down the aisles. And I remember, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, I remember that once they invited me out for lunch. They took me to a strip joint just to see what I would do, okay? So that's a long time ago. There is no question that the work environment has changed dramatically. There is no question that women in the workplace, women in science and technology in particular, have more support, have more protection. However, what I would argue is while many of the overt forms of discrimination have disappeared, while we do have protections against overt harassment, while people can't ask you whether you're going to have babies in the next year when they're offering you jobs, the forms of systemic discrimination, the structural barriers that women still face in the workplace, and particularly in science and technology, I would argue still exist. And certainly they're muted, certainly we have more recourse, but just reflecting on Dr. Marsden's study and my own experience at the university, there are all sorts of very subtle barriers that women face generally, but more particularly in science and technology. That being said, we have many shining examples of women who have managed to overcome those barriers by going over them, around them, knocking them down. And so I really don't want this, the few minutes that I have to be spent full of doom and gloom, because I do think that there are strategies to help young women succeed. But I think it's a mistake to think that the problems that I faced when I first graduated have entirely disappeared, because I would suggest that some of them still remain. And if we look at, for example, the fate of female academics, it's not that different than what we see in the private sector or what indeed we see in the public sector or in politics. And that is, I would argue, we see barriers and challenges at the societal level, which particularly in Western culture are very difficult and almost insidious in the way in which they stereotype gender roles. And I'll talk more about that because I do think it's really important. Secondly, we see issues at the organizational or institutional level, which again are very subtle, which have to do with, for example, how decisions are made about who to nominate for awards, who to support for certain positions, how references and referees work for people who do end up nominating for things. Very often, the whole system within academia relies on peer review and peer networks, which sounds objective, right? Sounds objective. The problem is, very often, peer review and the peer networks and the kinds of nomination processes that define who gets nominated to the Royal Society or for a CERC or whatever depend on informal networks and not very objective criteria. Even coming into my new role as the Vice President of Research and Innovation, when I first started, if I asked, who should we profile in the newsletter this week? Who should we put forward for an Ontario Centre of Excellence Young Researcher Award? Invariably, the names that came forward initially were always male. So why is that? Part of it is systemic. Part of it is that the people who are in positions of power tend to associate with people who are like them, and so when the positions of power are dominated by a particular segment of the population, it's not surprising that those are the people that you see promoted. Part of it, though, is also tied to the third set of barriers that I think are important to talk about. And that is some of the individual barriers. Have any of you heard of the Imposter Syndrome? Okay. The Imposter Syndrome, I would argue, is something that plagues women from the earliest of ages. So my favorite example is in grade 3. How many of you, any people in the room with little kids? There's standardized testing in public schools, right? In grade 3, the standardized tests show little girls outperform little boys in math and in English. Yet when asked, are you good at math? Are you good at English? Little boys are more likely to say yes. Okay? I would argue that that phenomena tends to permeate, tends to plague women all the way through their careers, so that very often women are less likely to say, pick me, I want to be nominated for this award. So you have two dimensions to the problem. One is the systemic networks of influence that tend to shape who gets nominated, who gets picked, who gets strong references, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, you often have women who feel less secure about putting themselves forward. And those two things taken together require very concerted and deliberate strategies to address. So when we talk about some of the systemic barriers at the societal level, which I think remain very, very important. If you think about representation of women in the media, if you think who gets presented as experts in the media, we've done analysis that shows invariably men are overrepresented. If we look at who occupies positions of leadership and expertise across sectors of society, it tends to be men. And where women are present, and this is based on an analysis just in Toronto, white women outnumber racialized women 10 to 1. So as soon as you start to intersect some of those other elements of diversity, you see a sadder and sadder and sadder picture. What do we need to do? What do we need to do? I think the first thing that we need to do is understand that the data and the evidence is really quite strong to suggest that the barriers are real, that they're not figments of anyone's imagination. And even if you yourself have not had these experiences, the fact is that other women have. So I think the first thing is to recognize that the problems exist. I think the second thing we have to recognize, as Dr. Marsden mentioned, is that institutions themselves have a responsibility. We did the diversity training for the Canada Research Chair's Secretariat, and while there are certainly things that the Secretariat could do, they argued, and there's some validity to this, that they can only react to nominations that are brought forward by the university. So if there are barriers within the university to women coming forward and progressing and being nominated, there's very little that the decision makers at the Secretariat can do. So pushing universities to bring forward diverse candidates is critically important, and ensuring that the universities have processes in place to seek out those women and other underrepresented groups who may not necessarily bring themselves forward, making sure there are mentoring and coaching and that access to resources is based on a level playing field is critically important. And at the end of the day, all of us as individuals have to think about how we will be successful regardless of the barriers, to reach out for the help that we want, to set high goals, and to achieve them. Thank you very much.